My name is Ben Carter. I live over in Santa Cruz, right over the hill, so I'm kind of a local-ish, but I'm from Virginia, so that's where my accent is from. Anybody from Virginia here? How about North Carolina? Anybody from North Carolina? No. Are you from West Virginia? Oh, really?
Yeah.
Cool. Where?
Charleston.
Okay, yeah, that's close enough. We're almost cousins there. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to work through my process of working with earthenware. And one of the reasons that I mentioned Virginia is that there's a great tradition of southern redwares that came out of Germany, actually, with Moravian potters. Have you guys ever heard of the Moravian potters? If you ever go to the Museum of it's the Museum of Southern Decorative Arts, I think, in Winston-Salem, and they've got a lot of Moravian pots. So when you think about the redware tradition in the South, these were utilitarian pots that were made for everyday wear, but a lot of them were more decorated than they had to be. So if you can in your mind imagine, say, like a Pennsylvania Dutch jug, those saltware jugs, if you guys have ever seen those, it's basically a big form, and then there's one blue cobalt decoration that usually was the number of the gallon that the jug held, or it was a decoration that related to just like a quick flourish. So if you think about that as being sparse early American decoration, if you keep moving over here, these were the Moravian potters, and they were decorating the hell out of everything. So this is like the more is more potters of the 1700s in the US. And again, it was a German influence. They had come from Germany to settle around Winston-Salem. There were three little towns, Bethesda. There was basically three towns that start with a B, which I can't remember their names now. But it was earthenware clay that was locally dug, decorated with white slip. And then sometimes they did sgraffito drawings, and sometimes it was slip trailing. So that inspires a lot of the work that I do, as well as other English slipware and other slipware traditions around the world where people are trying to copy porcelain. So in terms of the history, I think my pots are related to that, but they're not, directly influenced as much by that as more I'm working in that genre of pots. So I'm going to pass this pot around. This is just a little cup, and I've actually made a couple cups yesterday in my studio. And I'm going to decorate these today, but I wanted to pass around the textured ones first, because I want you guys to be able to feel this texture as it goes around. Now all that texture is going to go underneath a white slip. So when you think about my process, think about red clay, white slip. It's going to be bisqued to 04. Then I'm going to glaze it and do a few other things, and then glaze fire to around cone 1. So all of these pots that are here are all about cone 1. So a lot of times earthenware gets a bad rap for not being dense enough, but I know plenty of stonewares that are not this dense. So it's all about being able to fire your clay to maturity. With earthenware, you're never going to get maturity like you will with, like, say, a porcelain where everything actually vitrifies, but you're going to get levels of absorption that are closer to stoneware if you fire your earthenware a little bit hotter. Who uses earthenware here? What do you fire to? 04. 04, yeah. And do you do sculpture or do you do pots? Pots. Okay. Yeah, so when you think about earthenware, there's a lot going on in the dynamics of the clay. It's plastic, it can be thrown, it can be hand-built, it can be, formed in any way. But it's essentially all the clays that have washed down out of the mountains and collected in the riverbanks. And along the way, they have either picked up iron from their travels, or they have taken that iron from the parent rock that it decomposed from. But they're usually made up of tertiary clays, for you guys that are clay nerds. But what I like about it is it's really forgiving clay. Does anyone on the flip side here use porcelain? Any porcelain potters? Okay. So the way that I think about it is porcelain is like the girlfriend that keeps cheating on you, but you keep thinking if you change your behavior that she'll get better. And earthenware is the total opposite. Earthenware is like the loving spouse that, like, comes home and cooks you dinner and, like, you know, gives you a back rub every night because it's so easy to work with. And a lot of that has to do with its working properties when it's on the wheel, but also that it does not shrink much. And that ties into that fact that it's never going to vitrify. But its low shrinkage makes it so you can alter it really nicely. Oh yeah, if you guys want to, you can pass those cups around. There's 2 of them coming around. But before I trim this, or keep trimming this pot some more, I wanted to dunk those pots in a white de-flocculated slip. So has everybody seen at least one of the cups? Everybody pretty cool on that? Okay.
Explain a bit more what's de-flocculated.
Yes, I'm going to explain that right now, as a matter of fact. So when I mix my slip, it's a white slip that is on this handout. If you guys want to pass one around. If there's not enough handouts, we can probably make some more for you, so don't worry if you don't get one. I'll make sure you get one. But this is the Pete's White that's on the top here. This is a Pete Pinnell's recipe. And this slip, when it's first mixed, is the consistency of pudding. So think of like a real thick banana pudding. And then I put de-flocculant in it, which I've actually already de-flocculated it, so I'm not going to do it for you today here. But does anybody use slip cast molds here? Anybody slip casters? Okay. You guys already know what de-flocculation is, so I'll just start from the beginning. De-flocculant is a substance that you add that makes your slip more fluid without adding more water. So think about the relative fluidity of water. You've got water here which is really, really fluid, and then I've got slip that is more viscous. So you can understand that this is more fluid than this. That makes sense, right? So let's think about it if you had on this side of the spectrum actual pudding, so thick banana pudding. If I add de-flocculant to that, without adding more water, I am making it fluid. So everybody understands more de-flocculant, more fluidity, not more water content. And this is an important distinguishing characteristic. Because if you add too much water to your slip, when you dunk the pot in it, the pot's going to want to fall apart. Because the pot essentially is a sponge that's going to absorb all of that. Okay, so the best way to explain a de-flocculant is I want you to imagine that these ribs are clay particles, and imagine that they are magnetized. So when you're a kid, did you ever try to take 2 magnets and smash them together? And you notice that one side stuck together, but if you flipped it over, the other side wouldn't? And that's because positive and negative, should I stand back here to do this?
Thank you.
Yeah. That's because positive and negative will attract, but positive and positive will repel. And when that happens, as you try to push the positive and positive down on it, there's that force field pushing back against itself. So again, remember, these are clay particles. So if you can imagine a bucket full of clay particles, if you reverse the attraction so that everything is positive, they're all positive positive as opposed to positive negative, they will slide over top of each other the same way that a magnet slides over top when you try to push it down. This is the same theory that makes the fast trains in China and Japan work. They're magnetized tracks so that when you push, that the train is actually gliding up above the track on a very small level, and it can go really, really fast. Thank you. Small, because there's less resistance there. So when I add a de-flocculant like sodium silicate or Darvan number 7, let me write these down actually so you guys will remember. So the de-flocculant would be sodium silicate or Darvan 7. And actually, someone told me recently that Darvan 7 is not being made as much, that now it's Darvan 811 maybe. I'm not actually sure what the number is, but Darvan is the commercial name for it, so you'll be able to find that. But what that does is it changes all of those attractions so that they are, let me stand over here, so that they are positive, and those molecules slide across each other, making it so that it's more fluid, but I haven't added any more water. So is everyone pretty clear on why you would want to do that?
How much are you adding?
It's hard to say exactly, but I would say for a bucket this size, less than a teaspoon. So it's not very much. And you want to add it, if you're mixing, like let's say you're mixing a big bucket like that, you might mix the first part and add a teaspoon, and then just add drops and drops and drops while you have a drill going, a plunger that'll mix it, and it'll go from pudding to liquid right before your eyes. I probably should have done that because that's a fun science trick. But I already mixed this up at home. Also, this slip, if you look at that recipe, notice that I've added 4% Zercopax. Zercopax is an opacifier. You could use other opacifiers. So let's say you want to use tin. You could use tin. You could use titanium is going to give you a little bit more of an off-white. You can change any of those colorants that you want to based on what the quality of the white that you want. So notice that with Zercopax, and this is actually Zercopax in a very small amount of titanium, notice that it is off-white. It is not like white. And that warmth I really like. I think that speaks to the earthenware coming through the color behind it also. But you guys might decide you want like refrigerator white. So if you can experiment with, you know, as many colorants as you want in there. This is the same thing with a sky blue mason stain added to it. So you're getting a blue tinted background. It's also put on with a de-flocculated slip, so it's very thin, and you can see the runniness of this going on behind it where it was dipped. You see that less on the white, but the reason I want to highlight that is when I dunk this pot in there, it's your choice about how clean you want this process to be. If you want this process to be spotless, then when you dunk, you need to keep this pot exactly coming up and let it drip down off the top, and don't turn it back over. It'll just be thicker slip at the top, but you'll have no running that happens throughout the clay body. For me, I want the opposite. I like it when it looks drippy and runny in the background. So when I dunk this, I'm gonna dunk down, I'm gonna pull it up and I'm gonna shake it. And again, this is over a texture that's already on the pot. Now I'm going to tilt it and I'm going to shake it so that it all comes to one side. And then when I flip it, you're going to see, do you see it starts to run down? And for me, that's a little bit of energy that comes in the background that I cannot control. I mean, I can make it go in certain ways, but it is the least controlled part of my process. Everything else that I do in terms of drawing on things is super controlled. Like I can go in and make the line exactly where I want.
You do it when it's leather hard instead of bone dry.
Leather hard, yep. Yeah.
Is there a particular reason?
Yeah, it won't stick to bone dry, it'll crack off. Yeah. But you just need to match the shrinkage of your slip with the shrinkage of your clay. So you could formulate a bone dry slip if you wanted. I could probably try to find you one if you're interested in doing it bone dry. And I should say also before we get going too far, this is on earthenware, but this works for any of your clay bodies. So you could dunk stoneware, you could put earthenware slip on your porcelain clay. That would really make porcelain people mad. You should try that. You could do all sorts of things. The other thing though, if you did put earthenware clay on a porcelain, or earthenware slip on a porcelain clay and fire it up to cone 10, that earthenware is going to turn into a glaze. So just be aware you need to match your temperature that you, basically you want to max the temperature of the slip, the glaze, and the clay body, which I'm sure you guys all know. It'll turn into a glaze.
Glaze. Okay.
Yep. Have you guys ever, do you guys fire cone tin? Anyone fire cone tin? You make cone packs in a gas kiln. Have you ever noticed that the 04 cone is the best Timaku glaze ever? Next time you look down in your cone pack and it is so beautiful. It's like this really dark, rich black. So I'm just gonna finish trimming this real quick. I was hoping to do this before you guys got here, but I was eating grapes instead. So the question about what stage that I do everything, every time I put something in a slip, I let it go back to leather hard before I go to the next stage. So I'm gonna throw something out of the red clay, I'm gonna let it get to leather hard, then I'm gonna trim it, then it's gonna go in the white slip, then I'm gonna let it go back to leather hard, and then I'm gonna go sgraffito or stamping or whatever my process is that I'm doing on that. So as I'm trimming this, I'm trying to create a reciprocal curve between the foot and the body. That means that if you look at it down on this level, that this angle and that angle are like a mirror image of themselves. So it comes in like this, and the foot is like that. That's an aesthetic choice that I'm making. In terms of the throwing of the pots, I tend to always go for a softer, more volumetric aesthetic. So actually I'll just pass some pots around. Do you guys think about the volume that's implied by the way that I throw? I try to make the pots look as soft as possible. So you can pass that around too. Oh, there you go. I keep skipping you, sorry. And that softness is important to me because I feel like that it is so much about clay at this stage. You know, so much of my process, the sgraffito, the stamping, all that other stuff, that's about clay at the leather hard stage, and things tend to be hard and not as fluid and beautiful. But with the form, I can really accentuate the softness of clay at its most plastic, depending on how I handle it by altering it. Okay, that's good enough. And then you guys can pass that around too. If I had a straight-sided foot on that, let's see if any of these have straight feet on. Almost all these that I brought today have that same reciprocal curve, but say something like this, the straighter this is on a foot like this, the more round this is gonna look. So I'm gonna have contrast be the thing that accentuates the roundness of the pie. If I have a mirrored foot like that, all of the form language is speaking to the softness of the clay. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm just gonna throw a few things and put some textures on things before I actually decorate. Maybe I'll dunk this pot too. And then I'm gonna get someone to put these out in the sun. And usually you can see on these pots that I will have done the inside of the pot and then go back and do the outside. You do have to wait for it to get back to leather hard, so I'm skipping that part and just going straight to dunking it on the outside.
So ordinarily you would have the inside glaze.
Cool.
Slipped.
Slipped. Yep.
Directly in the sun.
In the sun, yeah, that'd be great. But to get that all to dry in the timing of an 1.5-hour demo, it's better to just do the outside and then put it out in the sun and let it do its thing. Okay, anybody have any questions about the slip before I move on to throwing? Cool, you guys are smart. Say that again? Sorry, I couldn't hear
What
you.
name of clay?
It's actually a clay body that I have mixed at East Bay Clay. But if you want a good earthenware, I put on there Linda's Red. That's Linda Arbuckle. She was my teacher at the University of Florida, and she's a great potter. That's a really good clay for 04, if you want to go to 04. If you want to go higher cone 1 to 3, you'll see this Nora's earthenware, and that's what I'm using right now.
There's a question. Is this low fire sleep or do they fire different fire?
No, it's low fire. But if you want, I can give you a cone 5 slip. Yeah. If you look, I brought some copies of my book, Mastering the Potter's Wheel, which is right over there. You guys are welcome to buy those, flip through them. And there's a cone 5 slip in the back that I think is a Val Cushing slip. Just look for that name, Val Cushing, and that'll go to cone 5. Yeah. So when I'm at home, I don't throw standing up. I actually throw sitting. I don't sit low to the ground. I sit with the wheel up on cinder blocks. And the way that I think about it is that I want to have my spine straight while I'm throwing. I started throwing when I was a teenager. I actually learned in high school. The public school that I went to in Virginia had a really good ceramic program, so I was kind of just fortunate and lucky to go to a public school that had clay. But in that school, I learned to throw sitting low to the ground, hunched over. And by the time I was 20, when I got my first production potter job, actually I think I was 18, I already had some pretty major back troubles. I also had a lot of wrist troubles. So I learned through a lot of chiropractic care that I needed to treat my back like a tool. So when you go to a pottery workshop, people always tend to ask like, oh, where'd you get this tool? Where'd you get that tool? None of the tools you guys use are as important as your own spine. And I think you guys know that after a couple hours of throwing hunched over and you feel like you can't sit up anymore. So one of the things that I do is when I'm sitting, I try to have the natural curve of my spine hold my body in position. So maybe I'll demonstrate this. I know this sounds silly to tell you how to sit in a chair, but this would have saved me like thousands and thousands of dollars. Let's find a stool. Yeah, can I borrow that stool?
Oh, there you go.
You got a stool? Okay. Now this one is extra tall, so this can demonstrate my point really well. So when you're sitting, you need to have the wheel raised up so that wherever you're sitting with your knees below your hips, that the wheel head is right where your elbow is in a 90-degree angle. So most of us learn to sit like this, but that is the opposite curve of your back. So your spine, when you're sitting here, your stomach goes forward because there's a curve in your spine that comes up out of your pelvis, curves this way, curves back through your upper part of your torso, and then when you get to the neck, there's another curve. So think about it like this, or not back like that, but you get the idea at the top there. So when you're throwing, if you're bending everything forward, you're compressing all of the discs in your back. So you got your vertebrae, and in between you've got discs. When you push forward there, it dehydrates that disc. And over time, that front side gets smaller and the back side wants to pop out. So has anyone had a bulging disc here? Extremely painful. It is the worst thing ever. Yeah, so the way that you get around doing that to your discs is that you want to sit so that your stomach is forward. So this is not the time to try to have the beach body and suck it in. Like push it out, let it be there, and try to have your ears back closer to your shoulders. So if you imagine that you're sitting here with your arms in your lap, you should be able to sit like this with your feet on the ground for 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes with no problem. The moment you start to put your head down and your shoulders start to come forward and your back starts to push out, you can sit that way for like a minute to two before you start having pain. So if you have pain, just remember, sit up and try to hinge from your hips like this, as opposed to rounding your spine like this. Now, because of that, when I'm throwing like this, I can't really quite hinge from my hips. So this is almost right, about at my 90-degree angle. But it would be great if it was just a little bit higher. That way when I'm throwing, if I'm standing up, I don't have to bend at all. Now, there you go, thanks. In the front of the book, I've got a bunch of exercises to help correct the back problems that you have. If you guys want to flip through the book, even if you don't buy a book, take a picture with your phone of those exercises and try to get yourself back into alignment without having to do what I did, which was go to many chiropractors and yoga classes to get back in the correct alignment. But having said all that, the way that I throw is not that unique. Like I tend to do things that almost every potter you'll see that's a production potter that throws a lot does, which is that I try to use not that much water. So notice that there's like not hardly any water in my splash pan. And I also want to have clear, forceful movements. Maybe forceful is not the right word. I want to have very direct movements in the way that I throw. So one thing that I've noticed, that if you're a beginner thrower, a lot of times people get nervous and they start to pull their hands up really fast in the spots that are wobbling the most. And that's actually the opposite thing that I want to do. If I have a wobble in the pot, I want to make sure that my hands go over that section in a really nice and slow way, so that it corrects that and pulls that wobble up to the top of the pot. This is like a little juice glass form, almost like a tumbler. And this is a great thing to show you guys a few different textures on this pot. But before I actually put the texture on with these little Tonka truck wheels that are made into the end of a dowel rod, in fact, I'll pass maybe that one around so you guys can feel. I want to torch this. And what I'm trying to do is I'm going to try to create a skin that's on the outside of the pot.
Quicker or more distinctly?
Yeah, and so that the wheel doesn't stick to the pot. Yeah. So I'm just going to move this up and down. The pot, let's see, so you see how the pot still wobbles. Like I still want it to be fluid. I don't want it to be hard, but I want it to have a skin on the outside. Then I'm going to take this, and technically what this is called a roulette. So have you guys ever seen a potter named Sunshine Cobb? You guys know her work? She makes these by hand out of clay, and she doesn't put it on a stick. She just holds her finger on the inside of the roulette, and then as she's throwing, it just spins through there. But that didn't work for me. So if you put it on a stick, it works really well. There's a few different clay manufacturers and tool makers that make them. So I think MKM, the people that make this, they also make some roulettes. So there's lots of different textures you can use. But what I'm thinking about when I'm doing this is the process in Japanese ceramics, especially with a guy named Shimoka, who was a student of Soji Hamada. He would always roll rope onto the surface of the pot. Have you guys ever seen those pots? They're really beautiful pots. And so he would roll, like let's say he throws like a platter, he would roll it around the surface so that you would have this texture. And I started thinking, well, what's the American equivalent to that? And so my brother-in-law bought me a little RC car that I took apart. And I wanted to think, like, how can I get this texture onto that pot that alludes to that history within Japanese ceramics, but that it is it is, I don't want to say my own touch, but it is an American touch. Throughout my career, you know, I've already talked about how I looked at Moravian pots, those earthenware pots. I've looked a lot at Japanese ceramics that are a part of the Mingei movement, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, with Bernard Leach and Shoji Hamada. I've looked a lot at Islamic pots from Turkey specifically, so Iznik ceramics. But one of the things that I want to do when I'm looking at my inspirations is I want to be able to think, why did they do that? I don't have a wire tool. Does anyone have a wire tool? Oh, you actually have your tools. This is awesome. Thank you so much. But when I'm looking at pots from history, I want to think, what were they trying to accomplish with the tools they were using, and how can I use a tool in a similar way without copying what they were doing? So this is the texture that was on one of those that already went around. So when I'm thinking about the texture that's underneath the slip, I'm trying to get as much visual depth onto the surface of the pots as possible. Oh, you can pass it around if you want. It's, yeah, as long as you don't mind getting your hands dirty, you can touch it.
These pots you have here, do they have any texture on there?
These don't. This is the one that I brought that's got a lot of slip trailing on it. Yeah. I was having a little bit of trouble with my slip sticking over top of textures for a while, so I kind of backed off the texture thing in my own work. But I feel like when I demonstrate, I always want to show people that, because when you're making earthenware pots, if you don't put the energy into the pot, the kiln is not going to give you any energy. As you guys know, I'm sure from your even cone 5-6 pots.
That's a good quote, man. Really good.
Yeah, all the energy that you want in your pot basically has to be either out of your fingers or through the process that you put the pot through as you decorate it. So I'm going to throw another one and then do a similar texture on the surface. And this next texture comes from this, which is like a plastic ravioli cutter. And this actually comes from cake decorating. So if you go to the kitchen store, you can find amazing tools. How are we doing on time?
It's 9:34.
And we're going till when?
10:30.
Perfect. So while I'm throwing this one and texturing it, I wanted to talk a little bit about my podcast. How many of you guys are podcast listeners? Cool. I feel like that in our age of technology, podcasts are the best way to intake information while you're working in the studio. So I got into recording podcasts with artists that I would interview as I travel around and teach workshops. I teach a lot of workshops like this, usually, like a 2-day weekend or sometimes a week, all different lengths. But what that gives me the ability to do as I travel around is I get to meet so many different artists. And one of the things that's become more and more important to me as I get farther in the field of ceramics is that the generation that's, or at least 2 generations above me, that their voices aren't lost. Because one thing you guys might notice in your own research is that a lot of the people that are getting attention through either social media or different forms of internet-based technology is that they tend to be younger people because they adopt the technology earlier. as to where someone like Warren McKenzie, who's a potter up in Stillwater, Minnesota, he is way less likely to have an Instagram account than, say, the 20-year-old that lives down the street from you guys that's a jewelry maker. And as I traveled around, I started to think, like, okay, how am I going to get these people's story on paper so that a couple generations from now, we don't forget the people that have helped define ceramics in the U.S. And so I started asking other people to write about their inspirations and the things that they loved, because I had this blog called Tales of a Red Clay Rambler. And what I realized is that no one wants to write for you. So if I ask you guys to write a paragraph about what you find important in your lives, you probably won't do it because it feels like work. You know, writing feels like work. But if I ask you to tell me, like, just tell me briefly what you think is important about art in your life, off the cuff, you can probably talk to me for 5 minutes about what you think is important. So I realized that if I could just get this older generation and, you know, people from my own generation to talk about what's important in their creativity, that I can make a document, an active living document of the field of ceramics. So I started doing that in 2012, I think. Yeah, 2012. And to date, this last week, I just released the 180th episode. So this is a major resource for you guys if you choose to download the episodes. And it's from people, everyone from, say, Warren McKenzie's level, you know, these master potters, down to the people that are emerging artists, like Objective Clay. Have you guys heard of Objective Clay? They're a group of potters that, if you just go to objectiveclay.com, I think it's 12 of them, maybe. And they're, I think, the best potters of my generation have banded together. So again, I'm putting a skin on this one. And they're, the podcasts are long-form interviews. They're usually between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. Okay, so this is the tool. I'm going to make a vertical line from the bottom up to the top. And I'm going to do that all the way around the pot. But the value of the long-form interview is interesting. Like, as you get people talking, after a while they forget that you have a microphone on. And hopefully you can get to a place in the interview where both myself and the interviewee are a little bit over our heads in the conversation, like we're talking about a topic that maybe they haven't thought about before. And sometimes you can get some really interesting conversations. So this texture, you can see, is a much slower texture than the wheel, the Tonka truck wheel. And it has a slightly different feeling because the vertical lines are accentuating the height of the pot, whereas on that other one, the horizontal lines, the nature of the actual decoration accentuates the width of the pot. So whenever you're putting lines of any type on the pot, think about it like your clothes. Because most of the time, you're going to dress yourself in a way that accentuates the best body parts that you feel like you have, hopefully. So think about that with your pots. But getting back to the podcast thing, I have a card back there that has the website, and there's a visual guide to the podcast on the website where you can go and you can see images of all 180 of the guests. So this last week's interview that I just released yesterday was with a guy named Thor Thoresen, and he worked with Marguerite Wildenhain who was a potter that was trained at the Bauhaus in Germany. And he took classes with her at a school called Pond Farm. Have you guys ever been to Pond Farm? It's down outside of Sonoma. I guess it's in Sonoma County. Pond Farm. And it's no longer active. Marguerite died in '85. So it stopped, I think, in the early 80s, but it went from the 40s, I think 44 maybe, up to 81. And it was an intensive summer workshop. So it'd be like going to, say, Pinland. Have you guys ever been to Pinland? This Pinland School of Craft? Yeah. It would be like taking a concentration at Pinland. So this interview is him talking about his experience being one of her students. And actually, she taught at the California College of Arts and Crafts also in Oakland before she set up Pond Farm. Okay, so this is that vertical texture, and you guys are welcome to take a look at that. Oh, I'll put it on here, thank you though. And you guys, you maybe want to pass that around. And actually, let me pass these tools with it. There you go. Okay, so that is the texture that is underneath white slip. Another way to think about decoration, and I haven't explicitly said this, so maybe I should talk about this now. I think that the hardest pots to decorate are round pots, because you haven't made any decisions about the space on the pot. It's almost like saying, well, I want to travel, but I'm going to travel the globe. Like, that's too big. You got to say, okay, I want to travel to China, or I want to travel to Turkey, or to Europe, or wherever you want to go. So the round pot, if you put texture underneath it, it's at least going to define how you're going to think about the pattern that's on top of it, because I've already made the decision to decorate the whole pot with texture. So with a pot like this, I'm going to treat the whole thing as if it is one piece of fabric wrapped around the form. So that's one sort of methodology for decoration. Another methodology is to break up the form into sections. And that's what I did on this form. So you can see I've broken the pot into 8 different sections, and I've pushed in those sections on the sides here so that I have 8 panels that go around the pot. So if you have 8, you might choose to make every other one different. This one I treated as one solid band, almost the same way as I treated the texture on that. But let's imagine for a second that I decorated this one and this one differently, but then this one repeats the same as this. So every other one is the same. I could also break it up so that I have 3 that are the same, but an uneven number of 5 on this side could be the same. And that would have an asymmetry to the way that you would think about the pattern on this pot. You could also just do one that's really, 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 really busy, and then the rest that have a really open, flowing decoration that travels all the way across there. So as you're doing this math in your head, challenge yourself to break up the pots that you're making into smaller and smaller chunks. If you feel like that you're getting confused with your decoration, try to divide the pot into 4 and just start with 4. And then as you get comfortable with 4, start to do 6, 8, 10, 12. Now, another thing that I want to talk about with these scallops here is that there's an energy to the form, because I have done the scallops, that affects the way you're going to think about the way that this pot is used. So on a cup like this or a cup like this pot is not divided up in any way, shape, or form. It's decorated all over in the same fashion. This one is divided into 4, this one is divided into 8. And I want you to think about that like rhythm. This is really going to throw the recording off, but I feel like I got to do this. So imagine this is the beat that you're bringing to your kitchen table. So when you're having dinner with your family, A beat like this, like say a division of 4, is fine. And a division of 8 is fine. But a division of 12, do you want that at your kitchen table? This is like your uncle that won't shut up at Thanksgiving dinner. It's too much. So when you think about the math, think about music. So remember, no division, 4, 8, and I didn't bring any other pots, but let's say a party pot, like a platter. If I'm going to make a platter, like a really big platter, I think a bigger form can handle that more intense scalloping or that more intense division of space. A simple pot that's for one person to use, like a cup, I think that's better with almost no division. So did that music to math ratio, does that kind of make sense in your heads? Good. Okay. Now let's talk about these textures I rolled in. Now I want to talk about how we can build up from the surface. So in this way I'm impressing something into the surface, almost like a stamp in a way. Now we're going to do some slip where I'm going to build it up. So what I've got here is my clay body. And the clay body, I just took my trim scraps. And actually I forgot to blend this before I got here, so this is some really kind of messy slip. Usually what I would do is I would sieve this slip through maybe like a 60 or an 80 mesh sieve to try to make it, thanks. To try to make it as smooth as possible. My clay body does not have a lot of grog in it, but if you're going to do what I'm doing here with a heavily grogged clay, I recommend that you sieve all the grog out of your clay. Because when you're making a brush stroke, you don't want that brush stroke to drag the grog across the top of your clay. So I'm going to do some paper resisting, and I'm going to cut just a small piece. Cool, thanks. And I'm going to do stripes that I'm going to put on this little cup there. But this paper resist technique can be done with stickers. Like let's say you want to have a circle. Don't spend all your time cutting it out. Just go to CVS and buy stickers, round stickers, and stick them onto the pot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out pieces of paper and then use water to wet down the paper, and it will naturally stick to the pot. I want to make sure that the pot is at leather hard when I do this. And there's no aesthetic judgment that I'm making on this stripe. I'm not trying to cut it. Not trying to cut it too precisely, but I am thinking about the width. So I'm going to alter between very thin stripes and very thick stripes. So when you're using a decorative motif for the first time, and this could be a stripe, this could be a polka dot, this could be whatever, when you're first using it, I recommend that you try as best you can to change the scale of the motif as you first start using the decoration. So maybe if you're using stripes, you make really, really thin stripes, and then you put those besides really, really thick ones. And the reason I recommend that you do this at the beginning is oftentimes when I start with the motif, I pick that motif intentionally, but I pick the scale kind of randomly. And if I don't mess around with that scale, I somehow fall in love with a flower or a dot at a certain scale, and the pots get pretty boring because it's almost like my brain is set to recognize that scale as the right scale, but that's not true. So that's a long way of saying that make yourself experiment to push through the fear of failure. That's a much quicker way to say that. Awesome. Okay. Okay, I've got a couple different brushes, but I really think a really nice wide brush is the best for laying on a thick slip. And this is the house slip, which is, it doesn't really say, but it's probably a clay body that's blended down. Do you know?
I have no idea.
What it is?
I just use it sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to take this one, and I'm just going to dunk these in water. And the paper is absorbent, and I can just lay it right onto the pot. And it sticks, just like that. So I'm going to go all the way around the pot and do this. And this is going to take a little bit of time. So while we're doing this, why don't you guys all stand up? Just shake it out a little. Just keep loose. If anyone needs any coffee, there's coffee out front and tea. And I'm not sure where the bathrooms are, but this would be a good time to take a bathroom break.
Right there.
Oh, perfect.
There's grapes out front too.
Yeah. You guys can see that these just stick up off the top. If that makes you nervous, you can wrap them over like that. And then that way you're not prone to knock them off. And it kind of makes a cool pattern on the inside. Now, as you can see, if the pot was if it was not leather hard enough, as you're adding this water and the paper, you would slowly saturate the pot. And the pot could get a little wobbly, which you might decide you like. You know, like with a technique like this, all the things that I'm trying to avoid doing, you might decide you want to play with that threshold and maybe even alter the pot while the slip is on the pot. So say push it into a square, you could push it into a square as it's absorbing. I forgot to cut some wider ones. Do you mind cutting out just some stripes that are wide?
Wider than that?
No, maybe like cut that into two. Maybe just two sections, that would be great.
Like one more like this?
That's good, just that
This
thick.
is good?
Yep, that's good, thank you. So I'm gonna put the thick one, and remember wherever the paper is gonna be the clay coming through, and wherever is in between those, that's gonna be the white slip. So two of these are going to be really thick, and that automatically creates a focal point within the pot. Like your eye is within that pattern going to jump and try to find that out as soon as possible when you pick this pot up. So you're creating visual interest through variation. Okay. Yes.
Do you find the type of paper make any difference?
I don't, but I do. For a while, I used Tyvek. Do you know Tyvek? What Tyvek is? If you go to the post office and get an express mailer, it feels like paper, but it's actually plastic. It's like almost like a plastic fabric, and it's really nice for using over and over again. So, like, let's say if I had 10 pots that I was going to do this on, and I had a more complex pattern, I would not want to have to cut it out over and over again. So using that Tyvek would allow this to be done over and over. Basically, if you use paper that's more absorbent, you use it less times. So watercolor paper, you'd only be able to use like once because it would just fade away. Now I've got this pot pretty wet at the bottom, so I'm going to torch the bottom of it and try not to catch the paper on fire. There's no sprinklers in this room, right? None? Okay.
Can you move your water bottle?
Yes. Okay. If it's too wet, you can't hold it. Now I'm going to hold this upside down and I'm going to brush with the direction of the pattern. So I'm not going to cross this way. I'm going to go down this way. And those wide ones, I probably should have put it down a little bit more because I can tell that the edges aren't going to be so crisp. And actually, if you let them dry, which I'm not going to do, they'll be very sharp. Now, the good thing about tucking those up is that you can just put the pot down on a banding wheel, or in this case, the wheel, and they'll stay stuck to the side like that. And I'm trying to get this on as thick as possible because this is pattern is texture. So in your head, think about this pattern as texture. This is not pattern as color. So this is pattern as color. So it's just a stripe, but what differentiates those stripes besides this graffito line is the contrast between the blue and white. But pattern as texture is going to be what's happening underneath. Whoop. Almost stuck that in the brown water. So I'm going to get my base coat on there. Half an hour. Okay, good. And then I'm going to force dry this. I would just, at home, I would do this and just put the pot outside. And actually, can you check those pots outside and see how they are? Okay, now do you see how some of the paper starts to dry and pull back? You want to stop if you're using a torch before that. Because if not, you're not going to be able to build up layers. The other thing you could do is use a thicker slip, and you could add a flocculant to the slip. So the opposite of a de-flocculant, and that's something like Epsom salts that will make it go on thicker. Cool, thanks. Perfect. Cool, thanks. I forgot what I was saying. What was I saying? Oh, a flocculant, so that it'll go on thicker.
About how much Epsom salt? Like to a gallon?
You know, I rarely flocculate, so I would look that up on Google. And the other thing is, when I've done it, I mix the Epsom salts with water, and I just keep like a little canister like this of Epsom salts. Yeah, and then just pour a little. So it's hard to say.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, because I'm putting this on with a big brush, you can see that there's starting to be brush strokes that develop. You can use that to your advantage throughout the process. So I'm gonna put it on really thick towards the rim and stop at about the 2/3 way down the pot. And that's also where the curve changes as it goes in. And when I go in and put decoration on over top of this, I might then either change the pattern subtly right there that's over top of it, or just let that textural difference be there, but let it accentuate the form. Okay. If I was doing this at home, I would probably just use a thicker slip and only do 2 coats. But this is a little thin, so I'm not going to do 3 coats, but the thicker the better. For what I want to use it for, which is texture. If you're doing this with, like, say, an underglaze over top of a white slip, you only need the underglaze to be thick enough that it will be opaque. So 2 coats would be fine with an underglaze. I'm trying to get it back to leather hard about before I peel them off. If the slip is still wet, the line is not going to be very sharp. If the slip is dry, it's going to be very sharp. I think what I'm going to do is we'll pop that out in the sun and then I'll start decorating these other ones. So that's one approach, which is just a very linear approach, pretty straightforward. Another thing would be to slip trail. And if you look at the bottom of this pot, do you see that there's a slip trailed pattern that originates from the central axis? So do you see there? And if you look up here, if you look behind, what I've done is that I've made a fence post. At the top here you can see a picket fence, like the pickets come up and terminate. But it's a very subtle thing, so you're probably not going to see this as much as you're going to feel it. So if you close your eyes and rub your hand around this pot, this slip trailing is a different way to get pattern and decoration into your brain. So for slip trailing, what I like to do is to use a cake bag. Okay, cool.
Under the lid.
Oh, yes. I'm glad you're paying attention. And this is just a standard cake decorating bag. It's a cloth bag. And this little thing is called a nib. And you can get these in all different shapes and assortments. This is for cake decorating. But what I'm trying to do is to lay on a thick line. If you want a thin line, you can use just a regular bulb slip trailer. So I'm sure you guys have used those before, the little red bulb with a needle at the end. Once you take the nib out, sometimes it's hard to, there we go, get it back in. And I'm going to load up the bag with a bunch of slip. I'm trying my best not to get it on the top of the bag because I'm going to roll the bag down, and that's going to give me the ability to change the pressure and therefore the amount of slip that comes out of it just by squeezing the bag. So that's why you would use a bag versus something that's hard. Like sometimes I see people use like a ketchup bottle, like the squeezy ketchup bottle you get at the fair or the boardwalk if you're in Santa Cruz and you get a hot dog. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? The red bottle. But the problem with that is it's harder to squeeze it. So if you take the bag and roll it down, okay, you see how the slip is going all crazy? That means the slip is too wet. So this is going to be an interesting demo. So I'm just going to leave that there for a second. Now I didn't bring a plate, but we're going to imagine that the surface of the wheel is going to be the plate that I would be doing the slip trailing on. So if you guys can't see, if you stand up, you're welcome to come here and see this. Okay, so when you've got something spinning, the most obvious thing would be to slip trail a concentric circle, and the decoration of the wheel itself would inform the decoration of the pot. But that's a little bit too easy. So maybe I want to start playing with the math here. And again, remember this would be on a plate. I'm going to do a pattern that's every other line. And I'm just going to go all the way out to the edge because it's confusing to stop. That one, this one, this one, this one. Okay, that one, this one. Okay, I think I got it all right. But so now this is going to be white slip on top of a red clay body. Then once it dries, I could then pour a white slip again over top of this plate. And what I would have is a texture that goes around like this. So for a plate, think about how you might want to serve, if it was a platter this big, think about the visual part of having this pattern be subtle, and underneath, say something like this, so all monochromatic, it's all white on white. But the subtlety of this, actually this is not so subtle, but if this was a little more subtle, imagine how that might change the way you think about the food that's being served on the plate. And you guys can maybe pass that around. So I brought these in. These, when I lived in China, these are made out of Yixing, big pot clay, which Yixing is actually famous for little teapots, little amazing hand-built teapots. But I really love their big pot clay. So I ran a school called the Pottery Workshop, which is in Shanghai, for 2.5 years from 2010 to 2013. And while I was there, I fell in love. That's Yixing clay with Jingdezhen porcelain over it. So that's the Jingdezhen is where porcelain was discovered. So there's something interesting, well, there was something interesting to me about covering Yixing clay, which is generally considered to not be as valuable, at least the big pot clay, with the white porcelain, which is considered to be the pinnacle of value in terms of the clay world. And that's something that I really think about a lot with the redware also, is what does it mean to cover something that's cheap and disposable like earthenware that's used for flower pots and roof tiles. If I decorate it in a way that alludes to porcelain, I'm changing the value of that object through the decoration. And to me, that's interesting.
How did they like it there?
My pots, or, yeah. I think that it was some sense that it was funny or comical. You know, like why would you? I think their thought is like, porcelain is so good, why would you dirty it? You know, like why would you try to change its value? But to me, that was what was interesting.
Did anyone there cover the?
Nah, not at all. In Japan, there's a tradition called kohiki, and that's a really beautiful white slip over a dark clay body. Has anybody ever seen any of that kohiki ware? Yeah, fired in wood kilns, so it has neutral spotting. Is really nice. So this is just a squiggle line. So you can see this is like what everyone does when they first start slip trailing, is they get, you know, really interested in the fluidity of the line. And what I want you to think about is, how do you get the thinnest line at some points and the thickest line at other points? So I did 5 of these, and some of them are better than others. So I'd say this line is the best line of all those, because it goes from thick up at the tip down to thin in the middle and then thick at the end. And think about it when you're drawing. You want to have that line quality go from thick to thin. Same with brushwork if you're doing like sumi brushwork. So this is more just the idea of, Okay, cool. Just the idea that I'm going to change things up as I go. But again, if I want to use the wheel to my advantage, if this was a plate, I might just experiment with working back in that concentric circle and then see what that looks like. That's a little too chaotic. But you guys kind of get the idea that it's you play with the slip. It is not as serious of a decoration as if I was doing sgraffito, where wherever the line I make, that's the only line I'm going to get. I can't really change that line.
Can this be done with underglaze?
The underglaze is too thin. You could do it with a colored slip though. So like let's say you take this, well this white might have a colorant added in it, but I would just start with a neutral clay base and then add 10% of your colorant. Okay. So now I'm looking at this pot. This is one of the ones that I put out in the sun earlier. And I'm thinking about what can I add to this that reflects on the fact that the lines underneath it are going vertically. So I think I'm going to do a decoration that's like this, which a decoration, if you think about this, when you see this from across the room, which part of the decoration do you notice first? Right. So you notice that flower because it's of contrast. The white is a high contrast from the green background. So the color makes it pop out like a focal point. But now instead of looking at the white, I want you to think about the diagonal layout of the negative space in between the white. So here, this rolls down, rolls back up through here. So it's a very simple negative space diagonal that is the reciprocal of the white flower diagonal. So I think a lot about negative space, and maybe you guys can pass one of these around. From looking at scroll paintings, so Chinese scroll paintings, I used to go into the Shanghai Museum and look at all those scrolls. And one of the things that they always did is that you would have these really like smaller mountains in the foreground, bigger mountains in the foreground with a very small person that's painted in there. And then you would have this, as the scroll goes up, you would have the mountains get smaller, and towards the back the mountains get really small. And the idea is that you're referencing visual distance. But what was interesting is they would always have these clouds that would float back through the mountains. And the clouds essentially were just negative space that was in there. And it set up this really direct foreground, middle ground, background. So when I'm thinking about the negative space on a pot like that, I'm trying to think that negative space that's the green, that's that farthest distance back. That's you looking back in space. So having said all of that, I'm going to take my stamps, which are a hodgepodge collection of stamps used for cutting. In fact, you want to pass that around. This is a stamp that's used for cutting out heavy icing for cakes. Fondant, I think that's called. Yeah. But what I use them for is, I think about this as like parts. So this little circle is the same thing as the inside here. And then this, which is a clay hole punch, that's what the outside edge is. So these two stamps together make up this flower. So when I think about stamping, I think of component parts and how I can rearrange those to make a different pattern. So this circle here is the same as the circle there, but because I put these flower petals around it, it changes the way you think about it on the pot. So only a few tools can make you lots and lots of flowers. So I'm going to do that diagonal negative space. So the way I think about it, like let's say if I'm starting here, I'm going to then put the next one high up at about the widest that I would see it out of the periphery. So somewhere right around up there. And I'm going to do a 4-panel design. And when I push it down, I roll it like this, because this surface is round. If I push it flat, nothing is going to happen. Like I'm going to miss about half the stamp. So I push it in and roll it around. Then I'm going to go in with my metal stamp. And put in, I think there's 8 here.
Is that from cooking supply?
This is actually from a clay supplier. So these are made so that you push down through and then push this out and it pops it out.
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, cool.
Do you want this now?
Yeah, that'd be good. So I'm going to just quickly go around and I'm going to try to finish these flowers.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm going to pass this pot around and you guys can see how this stamp works. So pass the stamp and the pot. Oh, sorry. But it's a very subtle thing. But then later I'm going to go in at the bisque stage. This pot's been bisqued. And I'm going to brush in underglaze into the stamped patterns. So if you look really closely, you'll notice that all these circles have red in them. They're actually red down in there.
So that's underglaze. The thing is the clay body showing through.
Yeah, you know, I do it with red because it looks like the clay body. But so you guys can kind of see as I peel that off that it's pretty thick, which is nice. Now this is a good example of I didn't push it down far enough, so that line gets to be a little wobbly. Okay. 10 more minutes. 10 more minutes.
If you look up once in a while.
Oh, we have a timekeeper here.
She's the timekeeping boss. She's keeping me on track. It's actually just paper. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to pass this around one time, and then I'm going to dunk it in the white slip. And it's going to, once the white slip goes on there, you're no longer going to see the contrast between the brown of the terracotta and the white. You're just going to see a texture that's white on white that goes around the pot. It would just leave a mess in your kiln. Yeah, the flake off. There's a raku process that's, what is that called? Lost raku or? Naked raku, that's what it's called. Okay. So I'm going to finish up doing a little bit of underglaze painting. Okay, now to accentuate what's happening with that stamp, I'm going to go in and do some underglaze brushwork around the stamp. So this is the stamped area. I almost think about that as a separate visual focal point. And then the underglaze I'm going to do around it, and think about these leaves as pointing to the next flower. So do you notice that the tip of the leaf points down to the next flower? And I think about that a lot. Leaves are little direction arrows. Flowers are points in which you stop. So leaves make your eye move. Flowers make your eye stop.
And this is when it's been after this time, correct?
No, actually, I would do this at this stage now, leather hard. So I didn't get to finish all of the stamps. So I'm going to leave some space. Cool, thanks. But the way I also think about underglaze is underglaze visually will not move. It's exactly wherever you put it, as to where glaze is going to run. So one of the things that I like about glaze, say like this blue, this sgraffito line, these leaves, they stay very still because they're carved into the clay. This glaze runs, so I'm using contrast there. And again, remember, we're talking about energy on the surface of the pot. So that running glaze beside the sgraffitoed underglazed leaves, there's a lot of energy in that contrast. So I'm going to go ahead and finish these stamps because it's hard to do the leaves without them.
So I haven't done much underglaze. Do you do underglaze and then do a clear on top of that?
Right. Yep. All these pots get dunked in a clear, then the colored glazes get applied over top. So that green is brushed over top of the clear glaze. And it's just a translucent green that has copper in it. It's if you look on that list, it's called Best Clear, and then I just add copper to that.
Do you see a difference in the underglaze effect before, if you do it on top of clear glaze versus if you put them on now and then after, you get a little more of a blur? What do you think?
Yeah, if you do the green underglaze over top of the clear, it still is opaque, and it looks a little bit chunky, like it doesn't have the fluidity of the glaze. So what I like to do is when I'm doing that translucent glaze that's green, I try to get that to run. So I actually very rarely do the underglaze over top of clear. You could do that, but it would look a little bit like, yeah. Now I'm going to take a sgraffito tool, and this is just one of those little triangle loop tools. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to loosely carve around my leaves. And I'm going to try to define the points of the leaf. And notice that that green really pops when it has a black line of the underglaze around it. So one of the things I'm working at when I'm thinking about surface design is how do I use contrast to either accentuate part of the decoration or hide part of the decoration. Probably should let the underglaze dry a little bit more. Okay, so now I'm going to pass this back around. The green underglaze is still wet, so don't touch the outside, try to just touch the inside if possible. There you go. And if you smudge it, don't worry too much.
How dry can the slip when you are adding the underglaze?
I like it to not have changed color yet. So you know when it dries so much that it'll actually change whiter? I try to avoid that. Okay. So that's underglaze that goes on underneath at the red clay after the white slip. This is all at the leather hard range. So think about it like this. This is all leather hard. This is bisque. And then glaze would be down here. So at bisque, I want to put liquid underglaze into the stamped. And then after glaze, I want to brush on colored glazes over top of clear. Yep, it all gets a solid cover coat of clear. And then over top of that.
But you don't glaze the clear and then re-glaze it.
Right.
It's all done.
Yeah. Okay, so for something like this, I'm just going to show you real quick. This is the watered down red. And it's really, really thin. Like it's basically like skim milk. Then I'm going to take this and I'm only going to brush it into the stamped area. And I'm not going to do it because my bucket of water is very dirty, but I would also have a clear bucket of water, and I would go in and I would rub off the top of this, and the only thing you would see is the underglaze that's left down into the stamped surface. So think about this. Do you guys ever do mishima? Anybody do mishima? So this is like mishima, but you're doing it at the bisque stage versus doing it at the leather hard stage. And that's important to me because I have white slip. I can't scrape back over top of my white slip or I'll scrape that away. But then I would just buff it off with a clean sponge, and you would just have that color down into those grooves. I'm going to pass that around too. Okay. Okay. Do you guys have any questions about any part of this process? I know this was really fast and a little discombobulated.
I'd like to find that bell fishing white slip for 45.
Yeah.
I looked at it in the back of the book. Wasn't it the Mocha diffusion one?
Yeah, I just didn't have the right name. Sorry about that. Mocha diffusion. Yeah. Yeah. The Val Cushing you can look up online if you want. I have recommended that, and maybe did I put that on my time's up?
Thank you, Ben.
They are, yes.